The air inside the small-town courthouse was heavy, as though the weight of justice itself pressed down on everyone present. Wooden benches creaked as townsfolk leaned forward, straining to catch every detail of the case that had drawn so much attention. The smell of polished oak mixed with the faint scent of old paper and ink, a reminder that lives had been judged within these walls for over a century. At the center of it all, sitting at the witness stand, was a child who looked far too small for the gravity of her surroundings. Her name was Emma Carter. Only 10 years old, with golden hair tucked nervously behind her ears, she looked even younger under the harsh glare of the courtroom lights. Her legs dangled from the witness chair, not quite reaching the floor, and her hands twisted nervously in her lap. She clutched the leash of her dog, a large German shepherd named Max, as though it were the last thread keeping her tethered to safety. The courtroom had been abuzz earlier when the judge allowed Max to accompany Emma inside. Normally, animals were not permitted in such serious proceedings, but this was not a normal case. Emma had been identified as the key witness in the trial of Daniel Harris, a man once considered a close family friend. He now stood accused of a crime that had shocked the community, to its core an act of betrayal so vile that many struggled to reconcile it with the smiling man who used to attend neighborhood barbecues and wave at children from his porch. For Emma, however, the betrayal was not abstract. It was personal, seared into her memory on a night she had tried so hard to forget. That night had stolen her words. Since then, she had barely spoken, retreating into silence whenever adults pressed her for answers. Therapists, social workers, and her own parents had tried to coax the truth from her lips, but she would only shake her head or whisper a single word before shutting down completely. The only one who seemed able to reach her was Max, the judge, a stern man with silver hair and sharp eyes, had considered this when granting the unusual request from Max to remain by Emma's side. He had seen too many children crumble under the pressure of testifying. Perhaps this dog, this silent guardian, would give her the courage she needed. Still, he knew the jury would expect more than comfort. They would need facts, clarity, testimony. Without Emma's voice, the case might fall apart. Across the room, the defendant sat rigidly at the table, his lawyer whispering in his ear. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes flicked toward Emma with a coldness that made her shrink further into her chair. She reached down, brushing her fingers across Max's fur. The dog lifted his head, amber eyes soft, body steady like a rock. Emma's breathing slowed at his touch, and a flicker of calm passed over her face. The prosecutor, a woman named Sarah Whitman, approached the stand with careful steps. She knew the fragility of this moment. Too much pressure, and the child might retreat into silence. Too little, and the truth might never be spoken. Her voice was gentle, almost maternal, as she began. "Emma," she said softly, "can you tell us your full name?" The girl's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her throat tightened as she felt dozens of eyes on her. She looked down at Max, who had shifted closer, his body pressed protectively against her legs. After a long moment, she whispered so faintly that only the microphone caught it. "Emma Carter." The jury leaned in, straining to hear. Sarah gave her a small, encouraging smile. "Thank you, Emma. You're very brave to be here today. Do you see the man sitting over there?" She gestured toward the defendant's table. Emma froze, her knuckles whitening around the leash. Her eyes flickered to the man, then away, as though the sight of him burned. Max pressed his nose against her hand, grounding her. But still, she could not speak. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. Some jurors exchanged worried glances. If this was the key witness, how could the trial proceed? The defense attorney rose. "Your Honor," he said sharply, "if the child is unable to testify, then her presence here serves no purpose." We must not indulge theatrics. The judge's gavel cracked against the wood. Sit down, Mr. Bradley. The witness will be given time. But even he wondered if this had been a mistake. The little girl seemed locked inside herself. Perhaps the trauma was too deep, the fear too strong. And then something small happened. Under the table, hidden from most eyes, Emma's hand moved. She gave the slightest gesture, a curl of her fingers, a touch against Max's paw. To anyone else, it meant nothing. But to Max, it was a command as clear as spoken words. The dog's ears pricked forward. He lifted his head, posture suddenly alert, and turned to face the courtroom. His gaze swept across the room, sharp and focused, before landing squarely on the defendant. A low rumble built in his chest, just loud enough for the silence of the room to carry it. Gasps filled the air. Heads turned toward the child and her dog. The judge leaned forward. His brows furrowed, not in anger, but in curiosity. He had seen service dogs comfort, guide, even protect. But this was different. This was deliberate. Emma's breathing quickened, but she didn't shrink this time. Her eyes lifted, meeting the judge's gaze for the briefest moment. Then, just as quickly, she looked back down, fingers still twined in Max's fur. Sarah Whitman, quick to adapt, seized the moment. "Emma," she said carefully, "did you just give Max a signal?" Emma's lips trembled. Her throat worked. And then, barely audible, but present, she whispered, "Yes." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection. This is highly irregular. A dog's behavior cannot be treated as evidence." The judge silenced him with a raised hand but kept his gaze fixed on the girl and her dog. His instincts told him something extraordinary was happening here, something that might change the entire course of the trial. Emma's hand stroked Max's back, and though her voice failed her, her courage grew in the quiet bond they shared. The courtroom waited, suspended in the heavy silence, unaware that this was only the beginning. Because Emma Carter, the silent witness, had found a way to speak through the hidden language she shared with her dog. The murmur of whispers still lingered in the courtroom as Judge Harrison struck his gavel, demanding order. The sharp crack of wood against wood echoed off the walls, silencing the crowd. Yet the energy in the room remained restless, like the air before a storm. Everyone had seen it, the child's hidden gesture, the dog's sharp reaction, and the subtle acknowledgement that something was happening beneath the surface. Emma sat rigid in the witness chair, her small hands clenched tightly around Max's leash. The German shepherd rested at her side again, but his posture had changed. He was no longer simply a quiet companion. His ears remained perked, his eyes sharp, as though waiting for the next command. Prosecutor Sarah Whitman sensed the shift. Years in the courtroom had taught her to pay attention to the unspoken details, the twitch of a juror's eyebrow, the way a witness fiddled with their sleeve. And now, it was the way Emma's trembling fingers moved ever so slightly against Max's fur. Sarah took a careful step forward. Her heels clicked softly against the polished wood floor, a rhythm that echoed in the silence. She kept her voice calm, soothing, as if she were speaking to her own child. "Emma," she began, "can you tell us what Max means to you?" Emma's lips pressed together. She glanced at the prosecutor, then quickly down at her lap. Her throat tightened, refusing to release words. But her fingers shifted again, this time brushing in a deliberate stroke across Max's paw. Immediately, Max's head lifted. His eyes darted toward the defendant, and then back to Emma, as if awaiting further instruction. He gave a low, quiet whine. The jurors exchanged startled looks. The defense attorney, Bradley, sprang from his chair. "Your Honor, this is absurd. A dog's behavior cannot substitute for testimony. If this child cannot speak, then the court cannot possibly." "Sit down, Mr. Bradley." Judge Harrison said firmly, his voice cutting through the room. The court will determine the weight of the evidence. But I will not dismiss the possibility that this child has a method of communication we do not yet fully understand. Bradley sat back, scowling, but his words had already planted seeds of doubt. Several jurors shifted uneasily. Sarah leaned closer to Emma, lowering her voice to a gentle hum, though the microphone caught each word. "Emma, is Max your helper?" Emma nodded faintly. Her eyes flickered to Max, then to the prosecutor. Her lips parted, and in a whisper as delicate as a feather, she breathed, "Yes." The whisper carried through the microphone, amplified enough for all to hear. Sarah felt the knot in her chest loosen. That single word, small, fragile, was progress. She pressed forward carefully, knowing the moment could collapse at any second. "Emma," she continued, "can you show us how Max helps you?" The girl's small hand trembled, but she nodded. Slowly, she gave another subtle gesture beneath the table, a flick of her wrist, a tap of her fingers against Max's side. The German shepherd rose to his feet in one smooth motion. His muscles rippled beneath his golden coat as he turned sharply, his gaze locking onto the defendant. The suddenness of it drew startled gasps from the gallery. Daniel Harris, the accused, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His jaw clenched as he adjusted his tie, his face flushing red. Max's gaze never wavered. The dog's low growl rumbled again, vibrating through the silence like distant thunder. The effect was electric. The jurors leaned forward, some with their mouths open. The bailiff instinctively reached for his belt, unsure if he would need to restrain the animal, though the dog never moved from Emma's side. Sarah's voice trembled, though she fought to keep it steady. "Emma, did you ask Max to do that?" Emma hesitated. Her chest rose and fell with rapid breaths. She squeezed her eyes shut, as if bracing herself against a wave. And then finally she whispered, "Yes." Her voice cracked on the single syllable, but it was enough. Sarah turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this child has developed a system of communication with her service dog. She is able to express herself through Max's responses." Bradley shot to his feet again. "This is outrageous. A courtroom is not a circus. You cannot let an animal dictate the outcome of a trial. This is prejudicial to the jury. And, Mr. Bradley," Judge Harrison interrupted, his tone sharper now, "sit down. I will decide what is admissible." He leaned forward, peering at Emma. His stern eyes softened slightly, though his voice remained steady. "Miss Carter, do you understand that when you give Max a signal, he does what you ask?" Emma looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. She nodded. "Do you also understand," the judge continued, "that we need to know the truth of what happened?" Her lips quivered. Her throat worked as if struggling to form words. Then, with trembling fingers, she brushed Max's back again. The German shepherd barked once, a sharp sound that rang through the chamber like a gavel striking wood. The jury jolted, startled. Emma's eyes darted toward the defendant, then down again, shame and fear crossing her face. Sarah seized the moment. "Emma," she asked softly, "did Max bark because of what that man did to you?" The courtroom fell into utter silence. Even the ceiling fans seemed to pause in the stillness of the moment. Emma's lips parted. Her voice, shaky but audible this time, slipped out. "Yes." The sound was like a fragile glass shattering, breaking through months of silence. The jury sat frozen, processing what they had just witnessed. The defendant shifted again, tugging at his collar, his eyes dark with frustration. Judge Harrison rapped his gavel again, though not in anger. His expression was one of wonder, almost disbelief. He had presided over hundreds of cases, listened to countless testimonies, but never had he seen something quite like this. A child too broken to speak had found her voice through a dog. He cleared his throat. "We will take a short recess," he announced. "Court will reconvene in 15 minutes. The gavel struck once more, and the room erupted into chaos. Jurors whispered urgently to one another. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. Spectators buzzed with theories. Emma remained in her seat, her body trembling. Max pressed against her side, steady and unyielding, his warmth grounding her. She buried her face in his fur, the corners of her lips twitching into the faintest, fleeting smile. For the first time since that terrible night, she had spoken a word of truth, and the world had listened. Outside the defendant's table, Bradley muttered angrily to his client. Harris's hands gripped the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. For the first time since the trial began, cracks had formed in his confident facade. And in the witness stand, Emma Carter clung to her dog, unaware that the silent signals she had shared with Max had just changed everything. When the gavel struck to reconvene, the courtroom settled again, though the restless tension in the air had only grown heavier. The recess had done little to ease the collective unease. Jurors whispered among themselves as they returned to their seats, their eyes drawn again and again to the little girl in the witness stand, and the dog pressed loyally against her side. Emma Carter sat curled slightly inward, her hands still clinging to Max's leash. Her gaze stayed fixed on the wooden floor, but the faint flush on her cheeks revealed the storm of emotions roiling inside her: fear, relief, and something else, something that had not been visible before. Resolve. The defendant, Daniel Harris, returned to his chair at the defense table. He looked less composed than he had earlier in the morning. His tie was loosened now, and his eyes darted occasionally toward Emma. What had once been a mask of calm indifference, now cracked with subtle signs of irritation. His attorney, Bradley, leaned close, whispering furiously, his gestures sharp and impatient. Harris only nodded stiffly, his jaw locked tight. Judge Harrison lifted his gavel once more. "The court will now resume. Miss Whitman, you may continue with your witness." Sarah Whitman rose, smoothing her jacket as she stepped carefully toward the stand. She knew the eyes of the entire courtroom were upon her, but her focus remained solely on the child. Her voice, as it had been before, was soft, gentle enough to coax, firm enough to guide. "Emma," she began, "you did very well earlier. Thank you for your courage." Emma's shoulders tensed at the attention, but Max pressed his body more firmly against her leg. She reached down, fingers brushing his fur, and exhaled slowly. Sarah continued, "Do you remember when Max barked?" Emma's lips twitched. She nodded faintly. "Was that because you gave him a signal?" Her fingers twitched against Max's back. "Yes," she whispered. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. It was such a small word, yet it carried a weight that filled every corner of the room. Sarah took a step closer. "Emma, can you show us again how Max helps you?" The girl hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the defendant. Harris's cold gaze bore into her like a shadow. She flinched, her shoulders curling inward, her lips pressing shut. Then her hand moved. It was small, subtle, so subtle that most would have missed it. But Max didn't. His ears pricked instantly, his head rising. Slowly, deliberately, the German shepherd turned his entire body toward the defendant's table. His muscles stiffened, his tail lowered, and from deep in his chest came a low, rolling growl. The sound rumbled through the room, primal and unignorable. Gasps erupted. Jurors' eyes widened, some shifting in their seats. Even the bailiff straightened, his hand hovering near his belt, as though preparing for an order. Daniel Harris shifted in his chair. For the first time, beads of sweat glistened at his hairline. He adjusted his collar, his lips pressed into a thin line. The growl deepened. "Order!" Judge Harrison barked, though his gaze never left the girl and her dog. Miss Carter, control your animal. Emma's trembling hand slid gently along Max's back. At once, the growl subsided, though the dog's eyes remained locked on Harris, unblinking and sharp. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Sarah cleared her throat softly. Emma, was that Max responding to your signal? The girl's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried enough. Yes. The defense attorney leapt to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is theatrics. We cannot treat a dog's growl as testimony. It's prejudicial. Judge Harrison slammed his gavel. Sit down, Mr. Bradley. You've made your objection clear. The court will decide the weight of this evidence. Bradley sat down, but not quietly. He muttered angrily to his client, who now sat with his arms folded tightly across his chest, glaring toward the child. Sarah crouched slightly, lowering her voice further, so it felt like a private conversation, despite the crowd hanging on every word. Emma, can you tell us why Max did that? Emma's throat bobbed. She looked at Max, then at the judge. For a moment, silence stretched on, so taut it could snap. Then, with a voice that cracked under the weight of fear, she whispered, Because. He knows. The words struck the room like lightning. The jury collectively inhaled, some clutching the arms of their chairs. Reporters scribbled furiously, pencils scratching paper in a frenzy. Judge Harrison leaned forward. His usually stern face showed something rarely seen in his courtroom. Astonishment. Knows what, Miss Carter? He asked carefully. Emma froze, her hands gripping Max's fur like a lifeline. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Her small chest rose and fell in rapid bursts, panic threatening to overwhelm her. Max whined softly, leaning into her leg. She stroked his ear with trembling fingers, grounding herself. After several long, agonizing seconds, she whispered, What he did. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah gave her a reassuring nod. Emma, you don't have to say it all at once. You're very brave. Just know you are safe here. Bradley slammed his hand on the table. This is outrageous. She's using the dog as a prop to sway the jury. But his words rang hollow. The jurors had seen Harris shift under Max's growl, had seen the fear in the man's eyes. No argument could erase what their instincts told them, that something true, raw, and undeniable had just surfaced. Judge Harrison raised a hand, silencing further protest. His eyes never left Emma. Miss Carter, he said softly, take your time. You are safe here. The little girl nodded faintly. She bent forward, pressing her forehead briefly against Max's fur. The dog licked her hand once, steady and grounding. When she sat back up, her voice was slightly louder. Max. He helps me say it when I can't. The courtroom fell utterly still again, every person riveted by the fragile strength in her words. Sarah straightened slowly, glancing toward the jury. She didn't need to argue the point. They had seen it with their own eyes, heard it with their own ears. The bond between Emma and her dog was not theatrics, it was truth. The judge finally spoke, his voice measured but filled with gravity. We will allow the witness to continue in her own way. The jury will weigh her testimony accordingly. Bradley sat back, seething. Harris clenched his fists under the table, his knuckles turning white. But there was no undoing what had been revealed. Emma stroked Max's fur once more, her small voice whispering words only he could hear. And though the courtroom did not yet know what secrets would come next, they all understood one thing. The little girl who had been silent for months had found her voice through the warning growl of a loyal dog. And the man at the defense table was no longer as confident as he once appeared. The courtroom buzzed faintly with murmurs as the judge called for order. Emma sat small and fragile in the oversized witness chair, her fingers curled tightly around Max's leash. Her German shepherd sat at her feet, calm yet poised, his sharp amber eyes flicking between the little girl and the defendant across the room. What had just unfolded left the room suspended in a kind of shocked disbelief. When Emma gave that second signal, Max hadn't just shifted or nudged closer like any therapy dog might. He had turned sharply toward the accused man, his hackles rising, a low growl rumbling from his chest. It was not an accident, not a random reaction. Everyone felt that Max was responding to something only Emma understood. The defense attorney leapt to his feet. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous," he snapped. "The animal is being used to influence the jury emotionally. Dogs are unpredictable. How can we possibly base testimony on their behavior?" Judge Halvorsen lifted a hand, silencing him. His stern gaze returned to the girl. "Emma," he said gently, lowering his tone, "was that signal intentional?" The girl nodded, barely perceptible, her chin trembling as she pressed her palm to Max's head. She whispered something so quiet, only the court reporter leaning forward could catch it. "He knows." The judge's brows knit. The silence stretched thick, charged with curiosity. Prosecutor Dana Myers seized the moment. "Your Honor, with permission, I'd like to approach the witness carefully. We've been made aware in therapy records that Emma has a system of communication with Max. Perhaps it's time we let her use it." The defense erupted in protest, but the judge, visibly intrigued, struck his gavel once. "Overruled. Proceed, Ms. Myers, but tread carefully." Dana approached the stand slowly, crouching slightly so she wasn't towering over Emma. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "you don't have to speak if it's too hard. But can you show us with Max how you tellin' things?" Emma hesitated, her small hand trembling against the dog's ear. For weeks in therapy, she had been practicing these very gestures with Max. It was their secret language, a way for her to share her memories without the crushing fear of saying them aloud. Her right hand shifted subtly under the wooden desk, fingers moving in a gesture that looked meaningless to the casual eye. Max instantly straightened, pressing his body closer to Emma. He gave a single sharp bark that echoed through the chamber. Gasps rippled among the spectators. Dana kept her voice calm. "Good, Emma. What does that signal mean?" Emma's lips trembled. Finally, she whispered, "It means..." "Yes." The judge leaned forward. The revelation was startling. This wasn't random, this was structured, intentional communication. Dana gently continued, "Emma, can you try again? Maybe something different?" Emma's hand flickered once more, this time a short tug on the leash combined with a faint motion of her fingers. Max turned toward the defendant again, his entire posture rigid, growl low and insistent. His gaze didn't waver. This time, Emma spoke clearly enough for all to hear. "That means..." "Danger." The courtroom broke into whispers, the tension electric. The bailiff called for silence. The defendant shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting as if the walls were closing in. Judge Halvorsen raised his brows, clearly astonished. "Remarkable," he murmured under his breath, before addressing the defense. "You may argue what you like about emotional influence, but what I see is a trained, consistent form of nonverbal testimony. This child is communicating in a way that is authentic to her." The defense attorney sputtered but sat down, clearly rattled. Dana leaned in closer, speaking softly but with conviction. "Emma, would you feel safe enough to tell us? If Max can help you." "What happened that night?" Emma's throat bogged as she swallowed hard. Her tiny hand squeezed Max's leash until her knuckles went white. Then, almost imperceptibly, she gave another signal, her index finger brushing along the dog's collar. Max immediately stood, placing both front paws firmly on the wooden ledge of the witness box, towering beside Emma protectively. The symbolism was powerful. The dog wasn't just her comfort. He was her shield. Emma inhaled shakily. "He came into my room," she whispered. The room froze. The first full sentence from Emma in months, delivered not alone, but with Max standing tall beside her. Judge Halvorson's hand paused above his gavel. He didn't strike it this time. Instead, his voice was steady, but heavy with emotion. "Proceed carefully, counselor," Dana nodded. She didn't push too hard. Instead, she allowed Emma to continue in fragments, always through her signals. Each gesture, each touch of the leash, was followed by Max's deliberate reaction. A bark, a growl, a protective stance. Each reaction reinforced Emma's hesitant words. "I said stop," Max whined softly, pressing his head into her lap. "He didn't," Max barked sharply. "He hurt me," Max growled, low and terrifying. Tears slid silently down the faces of jurors. Even the usually unshakable judge shifted in his seat, struggling to maintain composure. By the time Emma fell silent, burying her face into Max's fur, the courtroom understood. This was no act, no trick. This was a little girl breaking free of silence through the unwavering bond with her dog. The defense attorney attempted a weak objection, mumbling about theatrics. But his voice was drowned beneath the gravity of what had just transpired. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had felt it. Judge Halvorsen finally spoke, his voice ringing with authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we are witnessing is extraordinary. This child has found a way to tell her truth, one that cannot be dismissed. We will take a short recess." The gavel struck, but no one moved at first. The entire courtroom sat stunned, processing what they had just seen. A girl, once thought too broken to testify, had just shattered her silence, not with long statements, but with a secret language only her dog could translate. Emma clung to Max as if her life depended on it. And in a way, it had. For the first time, she had been heard. And the courtroom would never be the same. The courtroom was still buzzing when Judge Halvorsen declared a short recess. Lawyers shuffled papers, jurors whispered amongst themselves, and the defendant sat rigid, beads of sweat forming at his temple. Yet the most striking sight was Emma, curled tightly around Max, the German shepherd's steady heartbeat anchoring her small frame. She wasn't crying. She was simply holding on, exhausted by the courage it had taken to speak. The judge called both legal teams into his chambers for a brief discussion. Dana Myers, the prosecutor, entered first, her case files clutched to her chest. The defense attorney followed, visibly irritated, muttering about circus theatrics. The child psychologist who had been working with Emma, Dr. Lillian Carter, was invited in as well. Inside the judge's chambers, Dr. Carter, Judge Halvorsen began, leaning forward over his polished desk. "What exactly are we seeing here? This dog's behavior is far too precise to be coincidence." Dr. Carter adjusted her glasses, her expression calm but firm. "Your Honor, Emma has been in therapy with Max for over a year. She suffers from selective mutism, brought on by trauma. Direct questioning overwhelms her, often shutting her down completely. But through specialized therapy, she's been able to communicate using pre-taught signals. Max has been trained to respond consistently to each one." The judge tapped a finger against his desk. "So when she signals, the dog isn't guessing. He's following a learned response?" "Exactly," Dr. Carter confirmed. "For instance, when Emma touches his collar in a particular way, Max rises and takes a protective stance. That action has been conditioned to represent a danger or memory of harm. It's not a trick, it's therapy, and it's been remarkably effective. What you saw in the courtroom was Emma telling her truth, in the only way she feels safe." The defense attorney scoffed. "With respect, Your Honor, this is nothing but emotional manipulation. We're allowing an animal to serve as a mouthpiece for testimony. That's unprecedented, and frankly, outrageous." Dana Myers interjected sharply. What's outrageous is expecting a 10-year-old girl to relive unspeakable trauma without the tools she needs to communicate it. This dog isn't testifying. Emma is. Max is simply the bridge. The judge leaned back, considering both arguments. He had presided over dozens of difficult cases, but never one where a child's canine companion played such a pivotal role. Still, the authenticity of Emma's reactions was undeniable. Finally, he spoke. The court is not blind to the unique challenges of child witnesses, especially victims of trauma. I will allow Emma to continue using her signals with Max. The jury will be instructed that it is Emma's communication. We are observing not the dog's testimony. Counselor Myers, proceed carefully. Counselor Briggs. He glanced at the defense attorney. You'll have opportunity for cross-examination, though I strongly advise you tread with compassion. The gavel struck when they returned to the courtroom, and silence fell once more. Court resumes. Emma returned to the stand, Max at her side. Though her small frame looked weary, there was a steadiness in her posture now. The jury leaned forward, the room united in anticipation. Judge Halvorsen cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you will observe a unique method of testimony. The witness communicates through pre-established signals with her support animal. You are to understand that it is the child's communication you are receiving, not the animal's. Dana stepped forward, her tone measured and gentle. Emma, are you ready to continue? Emma glanced down at Max, stroking his ear. Then she gave the faintest nod. Good girl, Dana encouraged softly. Now, you told us earlier that he came into your room. Can you tell us more, using Max if you need to? Emma's small hand shifted beneath the railing. She tapped once on Max's leash. Immediately, Max gave a soft whine, leaning heavily against her legs. Emma whispered, I was scared. A few jurors dabbed at their eyes. Dana gave her time. And then? Emma's fingers moved again, 2 short squeezes of the leash. Max responded with a sharp bark that echoed across the silent room. Emma's voice, barely audible but firm, followed. He touched me. The defendant flinched, shifting in his chair. The weight of truth, Dana guided Emma gently, never rushing her. Piece by piece, gesture by gesture, Emma relayed her memories. Each movement of her hand brought Max to life, whether it was a growl, a bark, or a protective stance. Each reaction carried weight, reinforcing the truth of her words. The courtroom absorbed every detail in silence, the air heavy with the gravity of the child's courage. For the first time, Emma was in control of her story. She was not forced into the spotlight alone. Max stood as her shield, her translator, her unwavering ally. At one point, Dana asked, Emma, do you remember what you said to him that night? Emma nodded faintly. Her hand gave a small, trembling signal. Max lowered himself to the floor, resting his head in her lap. The gesture translated as comfort, reassurance. Emma's voice broke as she whispered, I said no. The courtroom's silence was deafening. The defense tries again. When Dinah finished her careful questioning, Judge Halvorsen turned to the defense. Counselor Briggs, your witness. The defense attorney rose, clearly uncomfortable. His strategy had been shaken by the undeniable impact of Emma's testimony. Still, he had to try. He approached slowly, forcing a smile. Emma, he began, his voice falsely gentle. You've practiced these signals with your dog many times, haven't you? Emma hesitated, but nodded. So, Briggs continued, isn't it possible that Max is simply doing what he was trained to do? That he's just performing tricks you taught him? Emma looked down at Max. Her small hand moved. Max instantly stood, his posture tall and protective. Then, Emma's voice rang out clearer than it had all day. No, he listens to me. He knows the truth. The firmness in her tone, paired with Max's unwavering stance, silenced the defense attorney mid-sentence. Briggs faltered, cleared his throat, and muttered, "No further questions." The jury had seen enough. A turning point. As Emma was gently escorted down from the stand, she clung to Max, burying her face in his fur. The courtroom had just witnessed something extraordinary, a child breaking her silence, not through the traditional path of testimony, but through the bond with her dog. The judge recessed for the day, but not before addressing the court. We are witnessing the resilience of the human spirit, aided by the loyalty of an animal. This court acknowledges Emma's bravery. Tomorrow, we will proceed with closing arguments. As the room emptied, whispers filled the air. Reporters scribbled furiously, already sensing this case would become national news. Jurors exchanged solemn glances, deeply moved. Even seasoned attorneys admitted privately they had never seen anything like it. In the corner, the defendant sat pale and shaken, his once confident smirk gone. He had underestimated a little girl and her dog. That evening outside the courthouse, the cool evening air greeted Emma and Max. For the first time in weeks, Emma looked lighter. She crouched down, wrapping her arms around Max's thick neck. "You did so good," she whispered, pressing her cheek against his fur. Max wagged his tail gently, leaning into her embrace. Her mother wiped her tears, watching with pride. "You were brave, sweetheart." So brave." Emma nodded faintly, but her gaze lingered on Max. For the first time, she believed she could keep going, not because she was fearless, but because she wasn't alone. Tomorrow would bring the final steps of the trial, but tonight, Emma could rest knowing the hardest part was behind her. She had spoken. She had been heard. And Max had carried her through. The following morning, the courthouse was unusually quiet. The prior day's testimony had rippled through the small town like wildfire. Reporters gathered outside, cameras flashing, their voices buzzing with the same headline. Child breaks silence in court with her dog by her side. Inside, though, tension reigned. The jury filed in solemnly, their faces set with an almost grave expression. They had been touched, even shaken, by what they had seen, the child's whispered words, the signals, the dog's unshakable loyalty. The defense had tried to dismiss it, but the jury's eyes had already witnessed a truth that no lawyer could erase. At the front, the defendant, Richard Kane, sat stiffly at the table. Once confident and smug, his posture now sagged with unease. His eyes darted across the room, then down to the table, then to his attorney, as if searching desperately for reassurance that no longer came. Emma sat with Max at her side, her hand resting gently on his back. Though she looked tired, there was a quiet strength in her now. She had faced the hardest part of her fear, and she had survived. The prosecution presses on Prosecutor Dana Myers, stood to address the court. Her voice was calm, her presence steady, but her words carried sharp conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "yesterday you witnessed courage in its purest form. A child who had been silenced by trauma found her voice not through tricks or theatrics, but through the bond with her service animal. Emma told you what happened in the only way she could, and Max confirmed it with every trained, deliberate response. You saw her signals. You heard her words. And you felt the truth." She gestured toward Emma, who sat quietly stroking Max's fur. "Children don't fabricate stories like this. Dogs don't act out elaborate lies. What you witnessed was honesty, a kind of raw honesty only possible when fear is stripped away by trust." Dana turned her gaze to the defendant, her eyes narrowing. Meanwhile, the defendant's reactions told their own story. You saw him shift, fidget, panic under the weight of a child's testimony. That is not the posture of an innocent man. It is the unraveling of guilt. The defendant under pressure, the defense attorney, Briggs, knew the damage had been done. He tried to salvage what little credibility he could. Rising, he turned toward the jury with rehearsed solemnity. "Members of the jury," he said, while the child's display was moving, "we must remind ourselves of the difference between emotion and evidence. Yes, the girl has endured trauma, but trauma does not equal truth. Dogs, as intelligent as they may be, cannot testify under oath. What you saw yesterday was a performance crafted intentionally, I dare say, to pull at your heartstrings." He cast a glance at Emma and Max. Sympathy is not justice. But even as he spoke, his client fidgeted in his chair. Kane's jaw clenched, his foot tapped rapidly against the floor, and sweat glistened across his forehead. Every word his lawyer delivered sounded hollow in comparison to the sincerity Emma had displayed. The jury's eyes weren't on Briggs. They were on Kane, and his body language betrayed him more than any witness ever could. Emma's return to the stand. Dinah called Emma back to the stand briefly, not to reopen wounds, but to reinforce her courage. "Emma," she said gently, "yesterday you told us something very brave. Today, I only want to ask, do you feel safer now?" Emma's hand gave a small signal. Max immediately wagged his tail and rested his head on her lap, exuding comfort. Emma smiled faintly. Yes, because of Max. The jury melted. It was not the kind of testimony that could be dismissed. It was simple, powerful, undeniable. Briggs declined further cross-examination, sensing that any attempt would only worsen matters. The defendant begins to crack. As the prosecution rested, all eyes turned to Kane. Would he testify? His attorney advised against it. He knew Kane's temper and arrogance could destroy whatever slim chance they had left. But Kane, feeling the walls close in, insisted. "I need to tell my side," he hissed under his breath. Against Briggs's better judgment, Kane took the stand. At first, his answers were smooth, rehearsed. He denied the allegations flatly, painting himself as a victim of misunderstanding. But under Dana's cross-examination, the cracks began to show. "Mr. Kane," she said, her tone sharp but steady, "if you claim innocence, why did you visibly react yesterday each time Emma gave a signal?" Kane shifted in his chair. I didn't. The jury saw you," Dana pressed. "You flinched when she said no. You sweated when Max growled. You panicked when she described what you did. Why would an innocent man react that way?" Kane's face flushed. Because it's ridiculous. I was frustrated. That dog is making a mockery of this court." His voice rose, sharp and defensive. The jury stiffened. Dana didn't have to say another word. His anger was speaking volumes. Max reacts at that moment. Emma, who had been watching quietly, gave an almost invisible signal, her thumb brushing against Max's paw. Max rose to his feet, standing tall, and let out a deep, low growl that rumbled across the room. His gaze fixed squarely on Kane, unblinking. The room froze. The defendant visibly recoiled, his chair screeching backward as he leaned away. It was instinctive, unplanned, and utterly damning. Dana's voice sliced through the silence. "Even the dog knows where the danger is." The courtroom atmosphere shifts. Judge Halvorsen struck his gavel for order, but the damage was done. The jury's perception had solidified. Kane was no longer the falsely accused. He was the predator exposed, stripped of his false confidence by a child and her dog. Kane's lawyer buried his face in his hands. He knew it was over. The jurors exchanged glances, their expressions grave. Some nodded faintly, others clenched their jaws. The courtroom atmosphere had shifted beyond repair for the defense. The human truth, when the court adjourned for the day, Emma's mother embraced her tightly. Tears streamed down her face, but they were tears of relief, not fear. "You were amazing," she whispered, stroking her daughter's hair. "You're so brave. Emma buried her face in Max's fur, whispering, "We did it, didn't we?" Max wagged his tail as if he understood every word. The defendant's isolation at night, Kane sat alone in his cell. The arrogance that had carried him through the trial was gone, replaced by rage and despair. He replayed the courtroom scene in his mind, the girl's small gestures, the dog's piercing eyes, the way the jury had looked at him like they already knew. For the first time, he realized he was losing, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The world watches meanwhile. Outside the courthouse, the world was watching. News outlets replayed the footage of Max's growl, of Emma's trembling voice, saying, "I said no." Experts debated the legal implications, but the public reaction was overwhelming. Most were moved, inspired, even awed by the courage of a child and the power of her dog. Headlines read, "Courage through Canine. Girl testifies with service dog. Courtroom stunned as child breaks." Silence. The case was no longer just local, it was national. Toward the verdict, as the trial neared its end, one thing became clear. Emma's signals had done more than tell her story. They had unraveled Kane's defense piece by piece, exposing his guilt not through complex evidence, but through the undeniable truth of a child's courage and a dog's loyalty. The next step was closing arguments and the verdict. And though Emma was only a child, she had already shifted the entire course of justice. The courthouse brimmed with anticipation. The gallery seats were filled to capacity. Reporters pressed in with notepads and cameras, and every juror carried the weight of what they had witnessed over the last week. It wasn't just another trial anymore. It had become a story about courage, silence, and the extraordinary bond between a child and her dog. Emma sat quietly at the prosecution's table, Max stretched at her feet. His ears flicked with every sound, his eyes alert, as if he too understood the importance of this final day. Emma's small hand rested gently on his back, steadying her nerves. The defendant, Richard Kane, appeared deflated. His once sharp suit hung awkwardly on his slouched frame, and his eyes darted nervously at the jury. The confidence that had fueled him at the start of the trial had evaporated, leaving only a shell of unease. Judge Halvorsen called the court to order, his gavel striking sharply against the block. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we will hear closing arguments. Following that, the jury will deliberate." Prosecution's closing argument Dana Myers rose, her voice firm yet compassionate as she addressed the jury. "Over the past several days, you have seen something extraordinary. You have seen a little girl who could not speak of her pain finally find the courage to do so, through the one being she trusts most in this world. You have heard her words, faint but undeniable, and you have watched as her signals prompted consistent, deliberate responses from Max, her trained service dog. This was not a performance. This was truth finding a way out. Richard Kane would like you to believe this was all an act, but tell me, can a child fabricate the fear you saw in her eyes? Can a dog be coached to react with such precision to gestures only his handler knows? And most importantly, did Kane's own reactions not betray him? You saw him flinch. You saw him sweat. You saw his mask fall away as the truth confronted him. Dana paused, allowing her words to settle. Justice is not always simple. Sometimes, truth must be uncovered in ways we don't expect. But justice is still justice. Emma deserves to be heard. And today, you have the power to give her what was taken from her: safety, protection, and the acknowledgement of her truth. We ask you to find Richard Kane guilty. Defense's closing argument Briggs rose with less conviction than he'd shown at the start of the trial. His voice tried for confidence, but it trembled slightly at the edges. Members of the jury, this case has stirred strong emotions. But emotion is not evidence. What you saw was a child with a dog, yes, but not a reliable form of testimony. Dogs cannot swear oaths. Dogs cannot be cross-examined. What you witnessed was touching, but sympathy must not blind you to reason. He pointed briefly at Max, who lifted his head and stared back. That animal's growls and barks cannot replace hard facts. And without verifiable evidence, you must ask yourselves, can you condemn a man based on feelings? But as Briggs spoke, Kane shifted again, his hands twitching, his jaw clenching. His visible agitation contrasted sharply with Emma's quiet strength. The jury's eyes caught it, and Briggs seemed to realize halfway through his argument that his words had already lost their power. The jury deliberates. When the judge dismissed the jury to deliberate, the courtroom exhaled collectively. Emma leaned down to hug Max, whispering something into his ear. The German shepherd's tail wagged gently, and Emma's shoulders loosened. The jurors filed into the deliberation room. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy. They began their discussion, not with evidence, because the evidence was largely circumstantial, but with what they had seen and felt. Juror number 3 spoke first. That girl. She wasn't lying. You could see it. Juror number 7 nodded. And that dog's reactions weren't random. Every signal matched what she said. It was real. Juror number 5 hesitated. But are we convicting a man based on a dog? Juror number 2 countered firmly. No, we're convicting based on a child's courage. The dog just helped her tell it. Hours passed as they weighed the facts and the emotions, the defense's doubts against the prosecution's conviction. By evening, the vote was unanimous. The verdict the jury returned to the courtroom. Emma clutched Max's collar, her heart racing. Her mother squeezed her hand, whispering, "Whatever happens, you've already won by speaking." Judge Halvorsen asked the foreperson to stand. In the case of the state versus Richard Kane on the charge of aggravated assault and child endangerment, how does the jury find the defendant? The foreperson's voice rang clear. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts. The gallery erupted in gasps and murmurs. Kane's face drained of color as officers moved in to restrain him. He shouted protests, but his words fell flat in the roar of relief sweeping through the room. Emma pressed her face into Max's fur, tears streaming down her cheeks, not of fear this time, but of release. Max licked her cheek gently, as if he understood the enormity of the moment. The judge's remarks. When order was restored, Judge Halvorsen addressed the court. His voice carried the weight of authority, but also rare emotion. This trial has been unlike any I have presided over in my career. We often speak of truth as something spoken aloud, as words sworn under oath. But truth is more than words. Sometimes it lies in the courage of a child, the loyalty of an animal, and the bond between them that cannot be broken. Emma, you have shown us that silence can still speak. That courage can take many forms. And Max, though you may not know the law, you have served justice more faithfully than many men ever could. The judge's voice cracked ever so slightly. This court recognizes the extraordinary bravery shown here. Let this case remind us that justice must adapt to hear even the quietest voices. He struck his gavel once more. Court is adjourned. Relief and resolution. As Kane was led away in handcuffs, the weight lifted from the courtroom. Emma's mother pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, sobbing into her hair. It's over, sweetheart. You're safe now. Emma turned to Max, crouching to wrap her arms around his neck. We did it, she whispered again, stronger this time. Dana approached, kneeling beside them. You were the bravest witness I've ever seen, Emma. And Max, she chuckled softly. You're the best co-counsel I could have asked for. Emma smiled faintly for the first time in days. The aftermath, outside the courthouse. Cameras flashed as Emma and Max walked out together. Reporters shouted questions, but Emma ignored them, holding tightly to her dog's leash. For once, she wasn't afraid of the crowd. She had faced something far scarier and emerged victorious. Across the nation, the story spread rapidly. Headlines praised the judge's decision, the bravery of a little girl, and the incredible role of her dog. Debates arose in legal circles about whether therapy animals should be more widely allowed in courtrooms. But for Emma, none of that mattered. What mattered was that she had been heard. And as she looked down at Max, wagging his tail beside her, she knew she would never be alone again. The courthouse steps had never seen such a gathering. Reporters swarmed like bees, microphones jutted forward, and cameras clicked in rapid bursts as Emma, her mother, and Max emerged into the late afternoon light. The trial was over, but in many ways, Emma's journey had only just begun. Her mother shielded her from the frenzy, but Emma did not shrink away this time. She clutched Max's leash, her small hand resting against his steady shoulder. Max walked confidently by her side, his head high, his fur glowing under the sun. For Emma, he was no longer just her guardian. He was her voice, her anchor, and the reason the world finally listened. A community awakens that night. The story spread across the country. Headlines filled screens and newspapers. Child's hidden signal to dog exposes truth in courtroom. Judge stunned by courage of girl and her canine ally. A dog's loyalty helps deliver justice. Talk shows debated the case. Legal scholars weighed in, and social media lit up with hashtags. Hashtag Emma and Max. Hashtag silent voices heard. Hashtag justice with pause. But beyond the headlines, something deeper stirred. Families with children who struggled to speak out about trauma began reaching out to organizations for help. Therapy dog programs saw a surge of volunteers, inspired by Max's unwavering loyalty. Even judges in other states began asking if animals could be integrated into courtroom proceedings to support vulnerable witnesses. Emma, still shy and cautious, had no idea how wide her story had spread. All she knew was that she had finally been heard, and that was enough. Healing at home, back in their modest home, life slowly settled into something resembling normal. Emma's room, once filled with shadows of fear, began to brighten again. She hung drawings of Max on her walls, each one showing him larger than life, sometimes with a cape, sometimes with a crown. To her, he was her superhero. Therapy sessions became less daunting. With Max curled at her feet, Emma began to speak more openly to her counselor, describing not only the fear she had endured, but also the strength she found in her dog. Each word she uttered was like lifting a stone off her chest. Her mother noticed the change too. She saw Emma laugh again, saw her running in the yard with Max, saw her building forts out of blankets without glancing nervously over her shoulder. For the first time in years, her daughter was truly living. Recognition for Max. A few weeks later, Emma and Max were invited to a small ceremony organized by a local advocacy group. The event was meant to honor both of them, but when Emma stepped onto the stage, she tugged gently at the microphone and whispered, "This is for Max." The audience smiled as the German Shepherd padded forward, tail wagging. A medal was placed around his neck, and the crowd erupted in applause. Emma hugged him tightly as cameras flashed, her face buried in his fur. Judge Halvosin himself attended the ceremony, standing tall but with a warmth rarely seen from the bench. "In my decades on the bench," he said, "I have never seen courage like I saw in that courtroom. Not just from Emma, but from Max, who showed us that justice sometimes comes with 4 legs and a wagging tail." The audience rose in a standing ovation. Emma's eyes sparkled with tears, but she smiled. For once, the applause didn't feel overwhelming. It felt right. The world beyond the courtroom, as weeks turned into months, Emma's case became more than a headline. It became a catalyst. Organizations began developing specialized training for therapy dogs to assist children in courtrooms. Max's role was cited in legal journals, and seminars used his story as a case study in adapting the justice system for vulnerable witnesses. Emma's mother was invited to speak at conferences about supporting children through trauma. Though public speaking terrified her, she agreed, saying, "If my daughter could face her abuser in court, the least I can do is share what we learned." And Emma? She continued to heal, day by day. She didn't want fame. She only wanted to live freely, with Max always by her side. But whether she wanted it or not, her bravery had become a beacon for countless others. A quiet conversation one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon. Emma and her mother sat on the porch swing, Max stretched across their feet. The air was cool, the sky painted in streaks of orange and pink. "Mom?" Emma asked softly. "Yes, sweetheart? Do you think people would have listened if it wasn't for Max?" Her mother paused, stroking Emma's hair. "I think Max gave you the courage to speak. But it was your truth, Emma. People listened because you were brave enough to share it." Emma looked down at Max, who lifted his head as if he understood every word. She smiled. "Then we're brave together." Her mother kissed her forehead. Always. Emma's dream that night. Emma dreamed of a future where children like her were never afraid to speak. She dreamed of courtrooms where dogs like Max sat proudly beside their humans, where judges and juries listened with compassion, and where silence no longer meant invisibility. When she woke, she scribbled on a piece of paper, "One day, I want to help other kids with dogs like Max." She tucked it under her pillow, a secret promise to herself. A new chapter. On a crisp autumn morning, months after the trial, Emma and Max walked to the park together. The leaves crunched beneath their feet, and children played nearby. For the first time, Emma didn't feel like an outsider. She joined in, throwing a ball for Max, laughing as he bounded after it with joyful energy. Parents nearby whispered her name, recognizing her from the news, but Emma no longer flinched. She didn't see herself as the girl who had been hurt. She saw herself as the girl who had been brave, with Max always at her side. Max returned with the ball, panting happily, his eyes bright. Emma crouched down, hugged him tight, and whispered, "We're free now." And for the first time in a long time, she truly believed it. The legacy of courage in the years that followed, Emma's story continued to ripple outward. Court systems across the nation adopted new measures to support vulnerable witnesses, including therapy animals. Programs were named after Max, and Emma, as she grew older, became an advocate for children's rights. But no matter how far the world carried her, she always remembered that it began with a single hidden signal in a courtroom, and the steadfast loyalty of her dog. Final scene. The story did not end in the courtroom, nor on the courthouse steps, nor even in the headlines that followed. It lived on in the bond between a girl and her dog, in the healing of silence broken, and in the hope it sparked for others still waiting to be heard. For Emma and Max, the world ahead was wide and full of possibility. They had faced the darkest of storms together and emerged into the light. And as long as they walked side by side, Emma knew she would never again be voiceless. Because with Max, her voice had always been there, loyal, fearless, and true.